Good afternoon. I'm Jason Marzak, Director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to those joining us in person today, including the many ambassadors, and our audience connecting online for today's conversation on the global and Latin American implications of Russia's invasion in partnership with the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Today is a special day at the Atlantic Council as we welcome an exceptional leader, Admiral Craig Faller, as a distinguished fellow. Admiral, welcome. Adrian Arch is here and will speak in a moment on your joining the Atlantic Council. At this incredibly consequential global moment, your thought leadership will be important to further guide our action-oriented work. While innocent Ukrainians suffer and risk their lives for freedom, the Kremlin's aggression has also strengthened the unity of alliances and partners and the ability to quickly design policy and mobilize resources behind a multi-pronged response. The implications extend beyond Europe as well. In the Americas, Russia has sought for some time to forge stronger alliances, most notably with Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Still, none voted against the UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion last week. Weeks before the invasion, President Bolsonaro of Brazil and President Fernandez of Argentina visited Moscow to deepen commercial ties. But today, Russia is economically isolated. Today, as we look at the days, weeks, and months ahead, Admiral Faller will speak with Ambassador Paula Dobriansky on the global reverberations of the Russian invasion, with a particular focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. As well, we'll look at the broader implications for China's role in Latin America and the Caribbean, Russia's disinformation, and regional migration. With that, I'd like to pass to Adrian Arch, Atlantic Council Executive Vice Chair and founder of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center and Adrian Arch Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, who will formally welcome Admiral Faller to the Atlantic Council.
Thank you, Jason. I'm delighted to welcome my friend, Admiral Craig Faller, who is going to join the Atlantic Council as Distinguished Fellow of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, ALAC, and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. I've known Admiral Faller for a number of years and have seen firsthand his exemplary leadership and commitment to Latin America and the Caribbean. As Distinguished Fellow, Admiral Faller brings his unparalleled expertise on global security and his keen understanding of the geopolitical dynamics in Latin America and the Caribbean to advise ALAC on the future of geostrategic competition in Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition, what role the United States can play to advance democratic values and hemispheric prosperity. Admiral Faller also brings decades of global, he's really much younger, decades of global national security leadership and experience to advise the Scowcroft Center on defense and security cooperation, as well as issues reflecting the new security technologies. From 2018 to 2021, Admiral Faller commanded the United States Southern Command in Miami, Florida, where he bolstered Western Hemisphere security by building strong, trusted partnerships between the U.S. military and Latin America and the Caribbean security forces. This is the role Admiral Faller served as before that, he served as the senior military assistant to Secretary of Defense James Mattis, where he provided assistance on matters such as military operations and national security strategy development. Admiral Craig, welcome to the Atlantic Council family. And now, over to Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, Vice Chair of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and Senior Fellow at the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs to moderate the keynote event.
Thank you so much, Adrienne, and welcome, Admiral. We're so delighted that you are here today, and welcome as a fellow to the Atlantic Council. Let's get underway. The first thing I really want to ask you is to put this issue, the issue of the brutal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What is the context of that in looking at geopolitics? What are the implications for geopolitics at large before we go into Latin America?
Oh, absolutely. It is the question of the day. I first want to start by thanking the Atlantic Council and the friends here for inviting me on. It's Atlantic Council's collaborative thought leaders. We have expression, you said let's get underway, we have expression in the naval services called all hands on deck. I mean, these wicked problems require all minds on deck, and so to be able to contribute in ways that are meaningful to the dialogue and the approaches that we're going to need to solve the Ukrainian crisis and the other security challenges is so important. In August of 2017, I was in Kiev with then Secretary Mattis. We were there for their independence parade and celebration. I met with President Poroshenko, Minister of Defense, Polikark, and it was clear how committed they were to democracy and to building strong security force. So fast forward, the things they were concerned about then that Putin had demonstrated that he would do in the Crimea, in the eastern Ukrainian region, that he had done in Georgia, and that he was threatening to do have played out. Putin's been consistent, if not brutal, and the human rights violations have been what's united the world really against him. As we listen to them articulate their challenges, we pledged to help get them defensive weapons, help professionalize their forces, and that work commenced. So my prayers go out to those professionals who are bravely fighting and acquitting themselves quite well against the brutal invasion. I'd say two big implications. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Chairman Milley, on his recent trip to Europe said, we've got to prevent a global war. In some respects, Russia's already at a global war. So how do we not allow this to escalate to the other NATO countries? And many are working on that very problem set. And there's been great unity. But how do you do that and then not allow Putin to feel that he's won because he hasn't felt the sting? And so I think that's a big implication moving forward that we've got to work. The second is, while that's the pressing problem confronting us all, the number one strategic challenge globally remains the People's Republic of China, the communist part of China, the dictatorship of Xi. So what do we learn from this that can be utilized for like-minded democracies to manage that competition so it doesn't end in conflict?
Do you see that in the geopolitical context that part of this move on the part of Putin is to diminish the U.S. leadership globally and U.S. power and influence, as well as to fragment our core relationship, in fact, with many of our allies? And allies, I don't mean just in Europe, but I mean across the globe.
I think that was 100% part of his design. I think he felt that the fragmentation was already there with fragmentation in the EU, discussions between the EU and NATO, and tensions there on future forces, looking at the U.S. and underestimating the U.S.'s ability to unify in the face of a common enemy that he's presented us. And so he saw all that and said, now's the time, I think, that contributed. And as you look at implications and second order impacts here, how do we maintain that unity? How do we increase and solidify it? So what it really means to be a partner, that's got to be key going forward. And we have to learn fast into that. And then I think we all have to examine whether these sanctions really work. They're unprecedented. Will they really work to mitigate the impact? The threat of it certainly didn't stop Putin.
Let's go to Latin America and the implications for Latin America. Now, as Jason introduced, he mentioned there have been a number of visits to Moscow. The Argentine president, a Brazilian president made visits to Moscow recently. But also there was a resolution that was put forward and passed at the United Nations, of which Both countries endorsed that condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What are Russia's intentions in Latin America today?
One of the things I love about Latin America and the Caribbean is it's a neighborhood. We all share so much more than we disagree on, and unfortunately sometimes we focus on disagreement. But I think this crisis has pointed us towards what we share, democratic values, and in the end, the votes in the UN said a lot more than some of the posturing previous to the invasion. I think some of them felt that he wouldn't go that far. Russia is not going to give up on their aims here. And just look at what's happened the last few years. They've increased their activity in Nicaragua, supporting Ortega in their counter-narcotics center there. They've increased their investments there. Their long-standing relationship with Cuba, they really have propped Cuba up. Increasingly, China's involved in Cuba. And then Venezuela, where Russia has been instrumental in improving the readiness of the Venezuelan armed forces, instrumental in having Maduro have a grip on cyber and the disinformation, and quite frankly, using Russia as a disinformation hub to undermine other stable democracies around the hemisphere. I don't see this crisis pulling Putin off his designs there. He has global designs.
The OAS will be holding its summit in Los Angeles, I believe, in the beginning of June. And in that context, it provides a forum and a platform for the Latin American and Caribbean countries to be outspoken about this issue. What do you see? What would you recommend that the OAS try to address at this time, given the situation?
No, I won't presuppose that I would be in a position to recommend a political leadership, but I think OAS and the Summit of the Americas are opportunities to continue to solidify the international unity and the partnerships that we need and will be needed to solve this and other wicked security problems, and that a key element is the absolute abject human rights abuses that Putin is carrying out. And that he's got to be held accountable for that, and that in alone should be enough glue to keep the international unity, and the OAS should just ride that forward to create unprecedented unity amongst its membership.
Well, the Secretary General of the OAS, Almagro, has certainly been very outspoken about freedom and human rights, and I can only imagine that this will be certainly a theme and a topic that will be addressed. You mentioned Venezuela. Let's go back to Venezuela, because there have been a number of visits. Last month, the Russian Deputy Prime Minister Borisov was there to re-solidify Russian-Venezuelan relations and ties, particularly in the commercial and trade context, and also energy looms large there. And then more recently, the Biden administration has sent officials to reach out to the Maduro regime to talk about the issue of energy and energy supplies. Put this in context. I mean, again, the relationship of Russia and Venezuela, and then whether or not the administration will really be able to break through that with Venezuela and the Maduro regime at this time in trying to appeal for opening the spigot, so to speak, on energy supplies.
Well, the crisis in Venezuela has been a generation in coming, as Chavez and Maduro have wrecked the country and the people have suffered. There's no finer diplomat than Ambassador Jimmy Story, our ambassador to Venezuela. So diplomacy has been at the forefront of our approach. It needs to remain at the forefront. So I think those efforts are a key piece of coming up with an approach that has the right balance of pressure and incentives to move Venezuela towards democracy and give the people what they deserve. A part of that's going to have to be dealing with the institutions which have been so corrupted over time. And that has to be accounted, and there's plenty of lessons to be learned from other crises in that regard. So this approach is key, but it's going to take time, and that time may not be on our side if we think it'll alleviate the prices at the gas pump.
Both Russia and China have been heavily invested in Venezuela in different contexts. And you mentioned earlier China, actually, in your opening comment to my question about the geopolitical context. What do you see as China's primary goals throughout the region, both in Latin America and the Caribbean?
One of the myths out there is that China's aims are purely economic. No, their aims are to create a new world order. that relabels what democracy is and looks a lot like dictatorship from what I've studied. And in the hemisphere, it's my assessment that they will do what's necessary to ensure their economic interests, and that is going to increasingly be using aggressive tactics. So I've seen increases in professional military education modeled after our own and offerings to countries. I've seen increases in their aggressiveness with which they're going after diplomacy. An example, we have a real opportunity in Guyana and Suriname now with governments that have come in and really want to improve themselves and get after corruption and get after good governance. And China's in there courting them for resources and access and influence. So in Guyana last year, signed an agreement with them, unprecedented, to do mill-to-mill work. And I got asked a question, hey, Admiral, what would you think about Chinese illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing off the coast here? And I said, I think I'll leave that to my hosts. But in a neighboring country, I can say that they are inside the exclusive economic zone daily. Within 10 minutes after that press conference, there was an op-ed in the local paper, accusing me and Southcom with our legacy of human rights abuses and things by the Chinese ambassador. So they are aggressive and they are emboldened. And it will be key for all of us to watch what they are learning with Ukraine and how they've handled it so far.
What do you think are the best U.S. strategies for dealing with China's involvement throughout the region, and thinking about your former hat as the head of Southcom?
We should look in a mirror. We should make sure we're the best partner, the most trusted partner, that we're consistent, that we approach our partnerships from a standpoint of respect, and certainly sit down and invest time in this hemisphere. But globally, we can't afford to pivot to a region. We've got to pivot to the globe and be a global leader, and that's going to come with resources. So we should invest appropriately in foreign assistance and security cooperation, and I think we're underinvested in that region, in this region particularly.
By the way, during the pandemic, and not that we're completely out of it, but almost, it seems, I think there was a strong appeal, in fact, from Latin America for assistance from the United States. Do you think we stepped forward in that regard?
We did. Wasn't initially fast enough, it never is, but we did step forward. And I know in Southcom, we were aggressive in both pursuing the funds necessary to put real programs on the table, but then delivering programs to our partners from every nation, really, except unfortunately where it's needed the most in Venezuela and Nicaragua, but to stay on the playing field and to be there. China was right alongside of us, and often as I flew into a country with some nice talking points and a handshake, a plane load of vaccines with a well-marked plane from China would fly in on the same day, and I'm sure it wasn't a coincidence.
You know, another weapon that's being deployed and used in throughout the region has been cyber warfare and in particular disinformation. Mm-hmm. Disinformation. Here, it was reported not too long ago in the New York Times how the Russians actually used disinformation to foment the protests, the massive protests that took place in Chile. And then actually the Colombians as well have pointed to Russian interference. The vice president of Colombia, Ramirez, she said quite starkly that the Russians have interfered and all kinds of disinformation have impacted society. Talk about that issue and how, even from the military context, how that's so crucial in our overall strategy and calculation.
Democracy is under assault, and Russia and China are the principal assault force after that democracy, and the hemisphere is ground zero for that assault. An example, my very first congressional hearing, and this is a lot better, this kind of format than a congressional hearing, by the way, Ambassador. Well, my very
I'm glad to hear that.
My very first congressional hearing, I came out of the hearing and there was film from Russian television of me and a statement that the invasion of Venezuela was underway. And it wasn't even my picture, so it wasn't that good of misinformation. And it was just complete nonsense. My second congressional hearing, there was a U.S. News and World Report quote, misquoting me, that was at odds to something that the administration had said, and that resulted in a call from the NSC. Never a fun thing. But when where the source of that U.S. News and World Report was a Russian RT snippet that misquoted me. So they are active. They're the number one Russia language programming outside of native Russian is Spanish. And they're extremely active in the hemisphere. Much of what they put out is accurate and sophisticated with just enough seeds in it to begin to bend. But they've gone far beyond that. Using technology and artificial intelligence, machine learning, you can create tens of thousands of persona. And they did try to shift the elections in Chile. They did work aggressively through some of their platforms in other countries. In Ecuador, there was a fantastic interagency effort that helped the Ecuadorians with a free and fair election, and it ended up in a good place, but it wasn't that way for a while, and Russia was involved in that.
What would you say are the best tools and instruments that we have to counter disinformation?
Our values 100%, and we never should stray from that, and we don't, but we've got to be more aggressive too in the message. I think the way that the administration and my old team at DOD, still on the team, has been really aggressive with pushing things out with Ukraine. Not always perfect, but it's high volume of fire with high fidelity and examples is the way to go. And we need to take that kind of campaign approach day in and day out with this assault on democracy.
Cyber. Say a word about cyber and what has been targeted in the region, how both the Chinese and the Russians are using cyber warfare to their effect.
Look in Venezuela. So the same sorts of cyber social control programs that Xi has imposed on the Chinese people, the PRC has exported to Venezuela to help Maduro control population, and Russia's right alongside helping Maduro control population, and then trying to export that more broadly. So there's efforts underway. It sounds very attractive. If you want to keep your city safe, to have a safe city, smart city program that you can get way under cost from China, but you're leveraging some of your sovereignty when all that data is going back to state-owned enterprises in China.
You know, let me step back because we've been talking about both Russia and China and their influence and impact throughout Latin America, the Caribbean. This issue of great power competition. Should we be concerned about great power competition going forward? Is this a new organizing principle, if you will, of foreign policy?
Well, there's nothing great about the competition, but it is great power. I think the National Defense Strategy of 2018 was liberating in some ways because instead of not being able to talk about what was happening, we were actually then told that we were in competition and we had to think about it that way. It seems so basic, but these strategic documents are foundational. I think it got it wrong in one respect, though. We were actually in conflict. So what we see as competition is conflict to Russia. And in the information space and in cyber, we have to think anew about what war means, because I believe we're in conflict.
You know why I asked the question? I asked the question because there have been some experts who've argued that we should focus solely on China and to the neglect of Russia. And I think that what we've witnessed play out in terms of the invasion of Ukraine certainly, I think, discounts that. I noticed that former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates had a piece the other day in which he cited that let's not forget that Russia has nuclear weapons and China also has demonstrated quite aggressive behavior, but we have to be looking at both fronts. Would you agree with that?
I read that piece that Secretary Gates wrote. It's spot on. We've got to look at the globe, and we have to really look at the key aspect of partnerships. And are we doing the right thing with actually putting teeth in our partnerships day in and day out in a consistent manner?
Admiral, I have one last question for you before we bring this really wonderful and fast-paced interview to a close, and our welcome to you. The issue of migration has been a major issue relative to the region. And as we know, migration numbers in Latin America continue to rise. I also think of how Colombia itself and also Brazil, the northern tier, has weathered the massive migration from Venezuela. How can the United States and the international community address this issue, What can we do effectively here?
Well, thanks. It is fast-paced. I wish the congressional hearings were that fast. Migration is a global problem. If you look at a 5-year slice of time in the hemisphere from, say, 2020 back, I mean, the numbers are staggering. They're in the tens of millions. And we tend to think from the U.S. of just the southern border, but the migration is multi-directional to Europe and south into the Costa Rica and Panama from Nicaragua. And so we have to work together at root causes. What causes people to lose hope? And it's a global problem. We're seeing I think we're now at 2 million in Ukraine, and that's just the start. And so what causes people to lose hope? How do we help restore hope? How do we have that, the other nations embrace that? And I think in that regard, there's been a lot of humanity offered in the Ukrainian crisis, and I think that's encouraging.
Well, thank you, Admiral. Outstanding interview. I'm glad it was better than a hearing.
It's a low bar.
And we're really delighted to welcome
you
to the Atlantic Council.
I'm delighted to be here.
It now gives me great pleasure to pass over the mic to Barry Pavel, who's the Senior Fellow and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Barry, over to you.
Well, thank you, Paula, and wow, that was a great conversation. Thanks to everyone who joined us for this event today. This is perfect for the Scowcroft Center. We're very proud to have joined our partners in the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center in putting on this first event, but not the last, with Admiral Faller. Today's conversation really helps to advance the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the U.S. and the world. I think we certainly did that today in a short amount of time. We strive very much to honor General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embody his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. We have been privileged today to hear from Admiral Faller at this historic juncture for geopolitics. And as always, we're grateful to our Vice Chair, Ambassador Dobriansky, for moderating, and to Adrienne Arsht for her opening remarks and her support for this really important effort. This event was so timely and so important. The geopolitical implications of Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine are reverberating as we speak across the world, including, of course, to the Americas. And while it is still unclear how the war will end, today's conversation helps us, I think, to make sense of the potential implications outside of Europe, as well as within Europe and across the world. So moving forward, please stay connected with the Atlantic Council as we continue to pay very close attention to these issues, including how they impact Moscow's efforts to cultivate influence in the Western Hemisphere and how the U.S. approaches Moscow's partners such as Venezuela. Thank you once again for joining us, and we hope you will join the Atlantic Council again in the near future.